The relentless winds of Lake Superior had sculpted Thomas's face over decades, etching lines of solitude and unwavering duty around his keen, sea-worn eyes. It was 1890, and he was the solitary sentinel, the veteran lighthouse keeper whose life was as predictable as the turning of the earth. His days unfolded in a precise rhythm of polishing the massive Fresnel lens, meticulously checking the clockwork mechanism, and meticulously logging the weather. Each sunrise brought the promise of another vigil. Each sunset the weight of responsibility for the mariners who trusted their lives to his beacon. The lighthouse, a stoic stone tower rising defiantly against the vast expanse of the lake, was more than just his workplace. It was his sanctuary, his prison, and his only remaining purpose. A lifetime ago, a different life had beckoned, filled with the warmth of a wife and the laughter of a child. But the lake, in its capricious cruelty, had claimed them, leaving Thomas with a void that only the steady pulse of the light seemed to fill. He had dedicated himself to this solitary existence, a silent pact with the unforgiving waters. He would guide others, ensuring no more lives were lost to its icy embrace even if he could not save his own. Lake Superior, a behemoth of fresh water, was particularly treacherous in winter. Its moods shifted with a chilling abruptness, transforming from placid expanse to raging tempest in a matter of hours. Thomas knew its every whisper, its every threat. He could sense the subtle shifts in the air pressure, the faint scent of snow carried on a distant gust, long before the sky betrayed its true intentions. Today, a peculiar stillness had settled over the water, a heavy quiet that often preceded a violent upheaval. The clouds, however, were beginning to gather on the western horizon, bruised and ominous, hinting at a distant storm brewing, slowly but inevitably making its way towards the isolated outpost. Through his powerful telescope, Thomas had observed the familiar silhouette of the Mariner's Hope, a supply ship due to arrive sometime the following day. Its regular passage was one of the few connections he had to the outside world, a fleeting glimpse of humanity beyond his lonely tower. He noted its position, calculated its approximate speed, and mentally charted its course, a silent prayer already forming for its safe journey through the impending weather. The initial peace of the afternoon, however, was shattered with a brutal suddenness. A violent blizzard, born from the brewing storm, descended upon the lighthouse like a predatory beast. The wind howled with an almost sentient fury, rattling the thick glass of the lantern room and making the entire tower groan in protest. Snow, thick and blinding, swirled in a chaotic vortex, reducing visibility to mere feet. Thomas, braced against the onslaught, felt an uneasy tremor run through the stone structure. Then came the first signs of trouble. The rhythmic hum of the light mechanism, usually a comforting drone, began to falter. The powerful beam, which had cut through the gloom for decades, flickered erratically, casting grotesque dancing shadows across the lantern room. Ominous clanking and grinding sounds emanated from the intricate gears below. Thomas's heart pounded with a cold dread. He rushed to inspect the mechanism, his experienced eyes scanning for any sign of malfunction. He peered intently at the complex array of cogs and chains, his brow furrowed with growing alarm. The light, his lifeblood, his purpose, suddenly sputtered, struggling for a moment like a dying breath, before plunging the entire tower into an absolute terrifying darkness. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The sudden, absolute darkness that enveloped the lantern room was more than just the absence of light. It was a physical blow, a chilling manifestation of disaster. Thomas felt a wave of icy panic wash over him, his breath catching in his throat. Disbelief warred with a terrifying certainty as he fumbled for the emergency lamp, his hands trembling slightly in the sudden void. The light, his sacred trust, was out. The automated mechanism, a marvel of engineering that had faithfully turned the massive Fresnel lens for years, had finally succumbed. He moved with frantic urgency, his old bones protesting, but his will unyielding. His fingers, gnarled from years of work, flew over the cold metal of the mechanism, seeking the familiar levers and gears. He tried to engage the backup system, then the emergency override, but each attempt was met with a sickening clunk or a stubborn refusal. The complex machinery, usually so responsive to his touch, was utterly, irrevocably broken. A vital cog, he realized with a sinking heart, had shattered, rendering the entire automated system useless. The rhythmic creak of the turning lens, the very heartbeat of the lighthouse, was now a deafening silence. A cold dread deeper than the blizzard's chill seeped into his soul as the full gravity of the situation crashed upon him. The mariner's hope. The supply ship, now without its guiding star, was steaming directly towards the treacherous rocks that lay hidden beneath the churning icy waters of Lake Superior. He pictured the ship, its crew unaware, sailing blindly into the teeth of the storm, drawn by the invisible pull of disaster. A vivid, horrifying memory flashed before his eyes. Another storm, decades ago, a ship named the Northern Star. He had been a younger keeper then, less experienced, and a momentary lapse in vigilance had cost lives. The image of splintered wood, swirling debris, and the desperate cries carried on the wind had haunted his nights ever since. He had promised himself solemnly, fiercely, that such a tragedy would never happen on his watch again. Yet here he was, facing a similar nightmare, the light extinguished, the lake claiming its due. A wave of profound regret, sharp and bitter, twisted in his gut. Outside, the blizzard intensified its furious assault. The wind howled like a banshee, battering the stone walls, and the entire tower swayed minutely. Snow piled against the lantern room windows, quickly frosting over, obscuring any view of the raging chaos beyond. Repairing the delicate mechanism outdoors was an impossibility, a suicidal folly in this maelstrom. He stood there for a moment, caught between despair and an unwavering, almost primal sense of duty. The easy path, the logical conclusion, was to surrender. No one would blame him. The storm was too fierce, the damage too great. But Thomas was not a man to surrender. His life, his very being, was intertwined with this light. It was his penance, his purpose, his only connection to the world he had lost. Then, amidst the crushing weight of hopelessness, a single, desperate idea began to form in his mind. It was audacious, physically punishing, and seemingly impossible. Yet it sparked a flicker of resolve within him. He remembered the old keepers, the tales of manual overrides, a forgotten mechanism designed for the most dire emergencies. He moved to the base of the massive lens, his eyes scanning the intricate framework. There, partially obscured by shadows, was a heavy iron crank, a relic from a bygone era, designed to turn the colossal lens by hand. He grasped the cold metal, testing its weight. It was enormous, built for strength, not for ease. The sheer size and weight of the mechanism it was designed to move suggested an almost superhuman effort would be required. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not a task for a few minutes or even a few hours. To provide a continuous guiding light, he would have to turn this crank relentlessly for the entire duration of the storm, until the mariner's hope was safely past the treacherous rocks. That meant 24 hours, perhaps more, of unceasing, grueling labor. The revelation was stark. A monumental challenge laid bare before him. His aging body, already weary from a lifetime of toil, would be pushed to its absolute limits, and likely beyond. Thomas gripped the heavy iron crank, the cold metal biting into his calloused palm. With a grunt that reverberated through his aging frame, he began the arduous task, the colossal Fresnel lens, slowly, ponderously, yielding to his will. The first rotation was a testament to sheer brute force, his muscles screaming in protest, tendons straining under the immense load. A sharp ache shot through his shoulders, down his back, and into his legs, a cruel reminder of his years and the task's overwhelming scale. Yet he pushed, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the blank wall beyond the lantern, refusing to acknowledge the pain that threatened to buckle his knees. His determination, a stubborn flame against the blizzard's fury, was fueled by vivid, almost hallucinatory visions of the mariner's hope. He saw the ship, a sturdy vessel, but fragile against Lake Superior's wrath, its decks slick with ice, its crew huddled against the gale. He pictured their faces, men like him, with families waiting, dependent on this light, on his unwavering effort. Each agonizing turn of the crank was a silent prayer, a desperate offering for their safe passage. The relentless passage of time began to blur, marked only by the rhythmic, grating creak of the gears as he forced them into motion. It was a monotonous, soul-crushing sound, yet it was also the heartbeat of his resolve, a steady mechanical pulse against the wild crescendo of the storm outside. He remembered his training, the stern, weathered face of his first mentor, impressing upon him the sacred duty of the light, the unyielding responsibility to those at sea. "The light never sleeps, Thomas," the old man had said, "and neither does the keeper." Those words echoed in the lantern room, a ghostly mantra pushing him forward. The blizzard raged outside, a malevolent entity clawing at the stone tower. The wind shrieked, a banshee's wail that threatened to tear the very structure from its foundation. Gusts hammered against the thick glass, sending tremors through the floor, making the entire lighthouse feel like a ship tossed on an angry sea. Thomas, soaked in sweat despite the biting cold, felt a brief, insidious sliver of doubt creep into his mind. Could he truly do this? Could one man, alone, stand against such power for so long? The thought was a venomous whisper, tempting him to cease, to surrender to the inevitable. But then another image flashed before his eyes, not of the ship, but of his wife, smiling, holding their child. A small forgotten photograph tucked into his breast pocket seemed to warm against his skin, a tangible link to the love he had lost, a renewed source of strength. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn paper, and the doubt receded, replaced by a fierce protective resolve. He had failed them once. He would not fail these strangers. He adjusted his grip, his hands raw and blistered, the muscles in his forearms burning with an intensity he hadn't felt in decades. Every fiber of his being screamed for rest, for warmth, for an end to this torment. But the light, now a beacon cutting through the swirling snow, was a testament to his continued effort, a fragile promise of safety in the overwhelming darkness. He focused on the beam, watching it sweep across the tumultuous expanse of Lake Superior, a slender thread of hope in a world consumed by chaos. Suddenly, a deep, resonant groan echoed through the lighthouse, a sound unlike the wind or the grinding gears. It was a structural complaint, a deep protesting sigh from the very bones of the tower. The entire lantern room vibrated violently, sending a shower of dust from the ceiling. Thomas paused, his heart leaping into his throat, his eyes darting around the ancient stone walls. The storm, it seemed, was not just battering the lighthouse. It was trying to tear it apart, threatening to bring his monumental effort crashing down around him. The sound was a chilling reminder that his battle was not only with the manual crank, but with the very elements themselves, intent on claiming all who dared to defy Lake Superior's fury. The structural groan from the lighthouse, a deep, unsettling sound, had momentarily frozen Thomas, his body tensed, awaiting further collapse. But the tower held, creaking and groaning like an old ship, yet standing firm. He exhaled slowly, the icy air burning his lungs, and resumed his relentless turning. However, the physical toll of his labor, combined with the sheer exhaustion and the psychological strain of the storm, began to manifest itself in disorienting ways. His vision blurred at the edges, the intricate patterns of the Fresnel lens wavering and distorting before his eyes. Dizziness assailed him with each rotation, a nauseating lurch that threatened to pull him from his feet. He swayed, gripping the crank like a lifeline, fighting to maintain his balance, his focus. Then, the auditory hallucinations began. Over the shriek of the wind and the grinding of the mechanism, he started to hear voices. Faint at first, like whispers carried on the gale, they slowly coalesced into familiar tones. He heard his wife's gentle laughter, the sweet, inquisitive voice of his child calling his name. They were so vivid, so real. He almost paused, straining to catch their words. But then, The comforting voices twisted, transforming into the desperate gurgling cries of the drowning sailors from that past tragedy. The ship lost so long ago to Lake Superior's unforgiving embrace. Their pleas for help, their dying gasps, echoed in the confined space of the lantern room, a chilling symphony of his deepest regrets and fears. He battled these internal demons as fiercely as he battled the external storm, shaking his head to clear the phantoms, his teeth grinding together in a desperate attempt to anchor himself to the brutal reality of the present. The cold, an insidious enemy, had begun to seep into the very core of the lighthouse. Despite his exertion, his extremities grew numb. His hands, raw and blistered from the constant friction, stiffened, making each grip on the cold iron crank a fresh agony. His fingers, now clumsy and unresponsive, struggled to maintain their hold, threatening to slip with every turn. He stopped briefly, leaning heavily against the cold metal casing of the lens, trying to rub some life back into his frozen digits, blowing warm air onto them, a futile gesture against the pervasive chill. He knew he couldn't afford a long stop. The light, his sole purpose, depended on his continuous motion. He forced himself to eat, gnawing on a piece of hardtack, washing it down with a swallow of lukewarm water from his flask. The meager rations offered little comfort, but he understood the necessity of maintaining his strength, however diminished. During one such brief, agonizing respite, a distant, mournful sound pierced the howling wind. It was the ship's horn, faint and distorted by the blizzard's fury, but undeniably there. It was a terrifying reminder, a stark signal that the mariner's hope was out there. Drawing closer, its crew unaware of the peril they faced, oblivious to the lone, exhausted man battling to guide them. He imagined the ship now, its sturdy hull battling the monstrous waves, its crew huddling below deck, perhaps sipping hot coffee, trusting implicitly in the unwavering beam of the lighthouse. The thought fueled a fresh surge of adrenaline, pushing him back to the crank. The line between reality and hallucination continued to blur. He saw shadowy figures flitting at the periphery of his vision, heard disjointed phrases whispered just out of reach. Was that his wife, standing by the door, her face etched with concern? Or was it merely the play of shadows cast by the flickering light of the lantern, his mind conjuring images from the depths of his memory and his profound loneliness? The challenge to his resolve was immense, a psychological gauntlet thrown down by the combined forces of nature and his own deteriorating mental state. Just as he felt the last vestiges of his sanity beginning to fray, a distinct, heavy thump reverberated through the entire lighthouse. It was not the wind, nor the groaning of the structure, nor the grinding of the gears. It was a solid, unmistakable impact, as if something substantial had struck the base of the tower. The lighthouse shuddered violently, and Thomas stumbled, his heart hammering against his ribs. He froze, straining his ears over the storm, his mind racing. What could it be? Had a massive ice floe driven by the gale collided with the stone foundation? Or worse, had the ship, disoriented and dangerously close, somehow grazed the treacherous rocks beneath the tower? The sound was a chilling, tangible confirmation that the stakes were higher than ever, that the battle was far from over, and that the mariner's hope was now perilously close to the very dangers he was fighting to avert. The thump against the base of the lighthouse, a jarring, solid impact, rattled the very stones of the tower and momentarily halted Thomas's desperate turning. His breath hitched, his body rigid with fear and adrenaline. He stumbled back from the crank, his eyes wide, peering through the small, frosted window of the lantern room. Outside, nothing but an impenetrable curtain of whiteout met his gaze. Snow so thick and furious it swallowed all light, all form, all hope of discerning what had struck the ancient structure. The wind shrieked a banshee's wail, mocking his attempt to see, to understand. Was it a rogue wave, a chunk of ice, or something far more ominous, something that signaled the ship's catastrophic proximity? A renewed surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, coursed through his veins, pushing him past the physical limits he thought he had already reached. Whatever it was, it underscored the undeniable urgency of his task. He had to keep the light burning, had to guide them away from whatever lurking peril had just announced its presence with such a terrifying jolt. He gripped the crank once more, his muscles screaming in protest, but his will unyielding. Each rotation was now a defiant act, a refusal to surrender to the storm's relentless assault. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, a faint gray light began to struggle through the blizzard's suffocating embrace. Dawn. The first signs of a new day, a fragile promise of morning, offered a brief, fleeting glimmer of hope. He watched the eastern horizon, shrouded in churning snow, as the darkness began its slow retreat, however reluctantly. The passage of time, once a blur of pain and exhaustion, now regained a semblance of order. He started to recount the rotations, his mind, despite its weariness, latching onto the methodical count, trying to track the remaining hours, to measure his dwindling endurance against the vastness of the task ahead. How much longer? 10 hours, 12? The thought was a crushing weight, but the faint light of dawn brought with it a brief moment of clarity, a renewed determination to see this through. However, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind howled louder, a furious crescendo accompanying the dawn, as if enraged by the sun's defiant attempt to pierce its dominion. The snow continued to lash against the glass, an endless, blinding onslaught. The promise of daylight offered no immediate reprieve from the brutal conditions. It only illuminated the relentless fury of Lake Superior. He closed his eyes for a moment, the rhythmic creak of the crank a hypnotic drone, and a memory surfaced, sharp and clear amidst the haze of exhaustion. He remembered a specific promise, made to his wife years ago, just before she left him for the final time. "Always protect those at sea, Thomas," she had whispered, her hand gently tracing the weathered lines on his cheek. "They depend on you just as I depend on you." Her words, a sacred vow, resonated deep within him, rekindling the embers of his purpose. This was not just about a ship. It was about honoring a promise, about fulfilling a sacred trust. As he continued his grueling labor, his eyes scanning the intricate mechanisms of the manual crank, a new, chilling discovery sent a fresh wave of dread through him. A small, critical gear, an essential component in the delicate dance of cogs and levers that allowed him to turn the massive lens, had developed a hairline crack. It was barely visible, a thin fissure spiderwebbing across the aged metal, but it was there. Each turn of the crank, each agonizing rotation, placed immense strain upon it, widening the crack infinitesimally. He could hear it now, a subtle, almost imperceptible groan emanating from the failing gear, distinct from the general clamor of the storm and the mechanism. The sound was a ticking clock, a stark warning that his fragile lifeline, the very means by which he kept the light alive, was on the verge of complete failure. His heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the storm, as he realized the true precariousness of his situation. The crack was growing, threatening to seize the entire mechanism at any moment, plunging the mariner's hope back into the deadly darkness. The ominous crack in the gear grew with each agonizing rotation, a metallic sigh of impending failure that threatened to seize the entire mechanism. Thomas, his face streaked with sweat and grime, experimented with different angles, trying to ease the unbearable strain on the failing part. He shifted his weight, pushed with his shoulder, anything to alleviate the grinding pressure that promised imminent collapse. The pain in his hands and arms was no longer a dull ache. It was a searing, relentless fire, his muscles screaming in protest, his worn joints grinding with every movement. His body, an aging vessel pushed far beyond its limits, begged for rest, for respite from the ceaseless torment. But rest was a luxury he could not afford, not while the mariner's hope battled the tempest outside. Desperate, he tore strips from his tattered shirt, binding his raw, swollen hands, trying to cushion the impact, to provide some meager protection against the relentless friction of the crank. The makeshift bandages offered little comfort, but the act itself was a testament to his unyielding will, a physical manifestation of his refusal to surrender. A final, desperate prayer for strength and endurance escaped his lips, a hoarse whisper lost amidst the storm's roar. He prayed not for himself, but for the nameless souls on the ship, for the lives that depended solely on his failing strength. Suddenly, a ship's horn sounded, closer now, its mournful blast cutting through the blizzard's fury with an alarming proximity. It was no longer a distant warning, it was a desperate cry, indicating the vessel was dangerously near the treacherous rocks he was fighting so valiantly to illuminate. His heart leaped into his throat, a cold dread seizing him. He strained his eyes against the swirling snow, his breath fogging the glass, searching for any sign, any indication of the ship's position. Then, through a momentary fragile gap in the ceaseless whiteout, he saw it, a brief, terrifying flash. The ship's mast light, a tiny defiant beacon against the overwhelming darkness. It was incredibly close, its outline momentarily visible before the snow swallowed it again. The sight galvanized him, a fresh jolt of adrenaline surging through his exhausted frame. The abstract threat had become horrifyingly real. He was the only thing standing between them and destruction, a solitary figure in a tower, battling a collapsing mechanism and his own failing body. The sheer weight of that realization pressed down on him, heavier than the crank itself. He turned, and turned, and turned, each revolution a battle against the crack that widened visibly with every movement. He could feel the metal groaning, protesting, pushing back against his efforts. The noise from the gear was no longer subtle. It was a high-pitched shriek, a death rattle announcing its imminent demise. He pressed on, sweat stinging his eyes, his vision blurring, his entire being focused on the singular, desperate task. With a sickening crunch that reverberated through his bones, the small, critical gear finally gave way. The metal fractured, splintering into jagged pieces. The crank, freed from its resistance, spun uselessly for a moment, then jammed with a final grinding protest. The mechanism seized completely, its rhythmic creak replaced by an ominous silence. The light, the precious beacon that had pierced the storm for hours, flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the lantern room and the entire treacherous coastline back into absolute, terrifying darkness. Thomas stumbled back, his hands falling uselessly to his sides, the sound of the broken gear echoing in his ears like a death knell. The mariner's hope, he knew, was now blind, adrift in the raging tempest, racing towards a fate he had fought so desperately to prevent. Thomas's immediate despair was a crushing weight, heavier than any sorrow he had ever known, as the mechanism stopped, the light dying once more. The sudden absolute darkness was a physical blow, a confirmation of his worst fears. The ship, so close, so dependent, was now utterly exposed to the unforgiving wrath of Lake Superior. For a fleeting moment, a profound sense of failure washed over him, threatening to drown his will. He had pushed his body to its absolute limits, battled the storm, and defied the encroaching madness, only to be defeated by a single fragile piece of metal. But this moment of surrender was brief, a flicker in the vast expanse of his unwavering dedication. His eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, scanned the broken assembly, his mind racing, refusing to accept defeat. The mariner's hope was out there, full of lives, and he was their last chance. He would not, could not, abandon them. He reached out, his numb fingers exploring the shattered remains of the gear, the sharp edges cutting into his skin, but he barely registered the pain. He needed a solution, however temporary, however desperate. His gaze swept across the lantern room, frantically searching for anything, any spare part, any tool, anything that could bridge the gap between destruction and salvation. His eyes fell upon an old, unused barometer, its glass cracked years ago, relegated to a dusty corner. He remembered its internal workings, the delicate brass gears and springs, intricate but sturdy. It was a long shot, a desperate improvisation, but it was all he had. With renewed purpose, he grabbed a heavy wrench and with a few precise, forceful blows dismantled the barometer, carefully extracting a small, robust brass cog. It wasn't a perfect fit, far from it, but it was close enough, a shard of hope in the overwhelming darkness. The immense difficulty of the repair in the dark and cold was almost insurmountable. His fingers, stiff with cold and exhaustion, fumbled with the tiny pins and screws. The biting wind whistling through the broken panes seemed to mock his efforts, threatening to snatch the delicate parts from his grasp. Each movement was an agony, his muscles protesting, his mind screaming for rest. Yet the image of the ship's crew, their faces etched with fear. Their lives hanging in the balance burned brightly in his mind, fueling a final, desperate surge of adrenaline. He gritted his teeth, his jaw aching, and pushed through the pain, his singular focus on the task at hand. He managed to jury-rig the mechanism, wedging the brass cog into place, securing it with a twisted piece of wire he'd found in his pocket. It was a precarious fix, fragile and barely functional, a testament to sheer willpower rather than engineering prowess. The entire assembly groaned under the strain, a symphony of distressed metal, but it held. With bated breath, he gripped the crank once more, his hands trembling, and slowly, painstakingly, tried to turn it. With a hesitant, grating shudder, the mechanism responded. The light flickered back to life, a weak, wavering beam at first, then strengthening, piercing the swirling snow once more. It was a dimmer light than before, less steady, demanding even more desperate, careful turning from Thomas. He had to adjust his rhythm, compensate for the new, uneven resistance, his body now acutely attuned to every subtle vibration of the jury-rigged gear. Each rotation was a monumental effort, a delicate dance between maintaining the light and preventing the fragile repair from collapsing entirely. Just as the beacon found its rhythm again, the ship's horn sounded once more, closer than ever, a long, drawn-out blast that no longer signaled warning, but clear, unmistakable distress. It was a sound that chilled Thomas to the bone, a desperate plea for salvation. He strained his eyes against the blizzard, his breath fogging the glass, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Then, through a momentary lull in the relentless onslaught of snow, he saw it. Not just a flash of mast light, but the full, terrifying outline of the Mariner's Hope, perilously close to the jagged coastline. He could discern the dark mass of its hull, the icy rigging, the desperate figures on deck, illuminated by the struggling light of his own creation. The ship was listing, caught in the treacherous currents, being inexorably drawn towards the deadly rocks that lay hidden beneath the churning water. His light, flickering and fragile, was the only thing standing between them and certain oblivion. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was the final push. Every ounce of his remaining strength, every beat of his weary heart, had to go into keeping that light alive. Thomas continued to turn the light, every rotation now a monumental effort that taxed his last reserves of strength. His hands, raw and bleeding, moved with a robotic precision born of sheer will, guiding the crank through its uneven arc. The jury-rigged brass cog groaned and shrieked, a constant reminder of the precarious balance between salvation and disaster. He watched, his eyes burning, as the flickering beam cut through the remaining snow squalls, a defiant spear of hope against the lake's furious assault. The ship, the Mariner's Hope, a dark silhouette against the tumultuous waves, slowly, painstakingly, began to alter its course. He saw the subtle shift in its angle, the bow gradually turning away from the murderous teeth of the rocks. A profound, bone-deep relief washed over him, momentarily eclipsing the agony in his limbs. It was working. His light, fragile and hard-won, was guiding them to safety. He pressed on, his gaze locked on the ship, his heart a drum against his ribs, beating in time with the rhythmic creak of the turning mechanism. Then, as if acknowledging his Herculean struggle, the storm finally began to break. The furious winds, which had raged for what felt like an eternity, started to subside, their howls diminishing to a mournful whine. The heavy, snow-laden clouds, which had blotted out the world, thinned and fractured. A faint, ethereal glow appeared on the eastern horizon, a promise of light piercing the oppressive darkness. And then, with breathtaking majesty, the first rays of full sunlight pierced through the retreating clouds, painting the turbulent waters of Lake Superior in hues of gold and crimson. In the glorious burgeoning light of dawn, Thomas saw it clearly. The Mariner's Hope, no longer a desperate silhouette, but a sturdy vessel, slowly but surely sailing away from the treacherous rocks. It was battered, certainly, its rigging iced over, its deck undoubtedly a scene of chaos, but it was safe. It was alive. A wave of exhaustion, profound and absolute, swept over him, stealing the last vestiges of his strength. His body, pushed beyond all conceivable limits, finally gave out. He stumbled, the crank slipping from his grasp, and collapsed onto the cold metal floor of the lantern room, the rhythmic creak of the light dying with his fall. A profound sense of peace, deeper and more complete than any joy he had ever known, washed over him, embracing him in its gentle folds as unconsciousness claimed him. Hours later, the captain and several crew members of the Mariner's Hope arrived at the lighthouse. They had seen the light flicker and die just as they cleared the danger and, after navigating to safer waters, had come ashore to investigate. They found Thomas, lying amidst the broken parts and improvised repairs, alive but utterly spent. His face, etched with exhaustion and grime, bore the marks of an impossible struggle. The captain, a grizzled veteran of the Great Lakes, knelt beside him, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. He saw the jury-rigged mechanism, the broken original gear, the bloodied hands, and understood with chilling clarity the magnitude of the solitary act that had saved his ship and his crew. They carefully carried Thomas back to his living quarters, tending to his injuries, offering him food and drink. He recovered slowly, his body aching, but his spirit renewed. News of his heroic deed spread quickly, carried by the grateful crew of the Mariner's Hope to every port. He was hailed as a hero, his name whispered with reverence among the sailors and townsfolk of Lake Superior. Visitors, once rare, now came to the lighthouse, eager to see the man who had defied the storm and saved so many lives. Yet, Thomas found his true reward, not in their praise or veneration. As he stood days later, looking out at the now calm, crystalline expanse of Lake Superior, the sun glinting off its surface, a profound sense of quiet satisfaction settled within him. The mechanism was repaired, the light once again rotating smoothly, effortlessly. His duty was fulfilled, not just to the lake, but to his own conscience, to the memory of his lost family. He had faced the darkness, both external and internal, and emerged victorious. The lives saved were his solace, the quiet knowledge of his unwavering dedication, his ultimate redemption. He was no longer just a solitary sentinel. He was a guardian, his heart brimming with a peace that transcended the wild beauty of Lake Superior.